I guess we'll officially get started. I know we're a little behind. We had some technical problems. This is Renee Tenney with Maricopa Association of Governments. As you will see, I am signed in as Rachel Brito right now. So I'm masquerading as Rachel on the chat portion of today. We're really, really excited that we've had such a great response to today's webinar on domestic violence and sex trafficking. This was a topic that came up at several meetings that I had attended, including the Governor's Commission to Prevent Violence Against Women, and a number of others. I think that's the one I remember the most. In really looking at what the correlation is between domestic violence and sex trafficking and how we can really collaborate to make sure that we're providing the best services to the victims of both abuse situations. So I'm really, really excited today to have Dr. Dominique Rosepowicz, did I say that right, with us, and I'm going to turn it over to her. Again, we've gone ahead and muted the lines just to kind of help eliminate noise, which has been a problem on our webinar trainings in the past. So I'm sorry, I'm distracted by the chats. So we are going to be turning it over now to Dr. Rosepowicz. Hello. Hopefully. Hold on, we're having cord issues. Here we go. All right, so my name is Dominique Rosepowicz. I'm a professor at ASU in the School of Social Work. I'm an associate professor, and I'm the director of the Office of Sex Trafficking Intervention Research, which we started about a year ago to try to become a little bit of an opportunity for people to use as a resource. So we're a resource, we do research, we provide support in the community, we run a number of different programs. We've received some grants to do services. We're starting a mentoring program for sex trafficking survivors. But one of the reasons that I'm really excited about speaking to you today is I feel like the sex trafficking and domestic violence communities are the same community, but so often we find a new problem, or an old problem in this case, and we feel like it's a very separate entity. And I want to talk to you today about how these two communities can work together, how we can support each other, and what it is that we can do. So I'd like to talk to you a little bit about domestic violence and sex trafficking. Oops, hold on. And we're just going to move on there we go. So the first slide that you see describes the difference between domestic violence. I'm sure all of you are very familiar with the definition of domestic violence being between family and household members, that there's a power differential, and there are all these very clear descriptions of abuse. In 2000, the federal government passed the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, and that was the first time we had a very clear definition of what sex trafficking was. So it involves language including force, fraud, and coercion. Anyone under the age of 18 who's been trafficked for sex, for whatever it is, place to stay, money, drugs, is a victim of sex trafficking. And anyone over the age of 18 who can demonstrate that they've been trafficked by a person, a trafficker, a pimp, a parent, a boyfriend, a husband, is also considered a sex trafficking victim. So what we see is these two have some definition differences, but when we get a little bit deeper into the problems, I think you'll see that there are quite a lot of similarities. Can you help me advance?
Oh, I'm sorry.
I don't.
Here we go.
So there are, excuse me, there are some important things just to know about the strategies and roles within sex trafficking, some language for you, that we identify victims in this community, in the Phoenix and Arizona community, to be male, female, or transgendered. We have minors, who we call domestic minor sex trafficking victims, who are from the United States. We certainly have international clients here also. And adults, we have same male, female, as well as transgendered folks who are identified as victims of sex trafficking. A trafficker is also identified as a pimp. We're trying to pull away a little bit from the pimp language simply because it is a bit glorified. A trafficker can be someone who transports the person, force, fraud, and coerces them into exchanging sex for money, takes their money, can be very violent, can be a boyfriend, can have a relationship with the victim, and that's what we're going to talk more about. What we want to make clear is that trafficking has nothing to do in the United States about crossing state line. That's the Mann Act, and that's actually a different statute to pay attention to. This trafficker is a person who is using force, fraud, or coercion to get someone to do a sex act in exchange for something else, and then taking the gain. A buyer, we also call a John or a customer. I always feel bad for people whose name is John. But these are people who are buyers of sex. They buy it through the pimp to the customer, to the victim. They can buy it straight from the victim. But these are the people who are exchanging anything, a dollar, drugs, alcohol, a place to stay, to that victim for the exchange of sex services. There are a couple of community members that are important that we need to pay attention to when we talk about combating sex trafficking. The supporting role of a hotel, motel, or resort. Oftentimes we've heard customers say that the maitre d' at their hotel gave them the phone number of the girl who might have been a minor who came up to their room. Maitre d' called the pimp. Pimp sent the girl in, drove her there, dropped her off, had her go up to the person's room. We want to be really careful to acknowledge that we don't think hotels, motels, and resorts are complicit in it, that they are having any gain specifically from the trafficking, but I do know that they have not been well trained, and it would be really beneficial to our community to train hotels, motels, and resorts about trafficking and how this could be helpful to prevent more trafficking victimizations. Credit card companies, one of the problems we see is that you can post a sex ad online on Backpage.com or a bunch of other web pages that we have access to here in our community for $13, and you can use a fake credit card. You don't have to register it. You don't have to have any identification to place that ad online using your credit card. So the online facilitators would be places like Backpage.com. Craigslist used to be a participant in this, but have really committed to staying out of child prostitution and out of the prostitution of adults, and have been really careful about what their website has on there. But we have many, many other venues that people are trafficked by whoever is their trafficker. So we see pimps placing the ads. We see pimps making and traffickers making victims place their own ads. We see lots of variation, but it's important to note that these three groups also have a role in sex trafficking. So some things to think about when you think of sexual exploitation, that oftentimes our victims report sexual abuse or assault. So during the relationships that they enter, whether it's getting into someone's car or into a hotel room or in an alley or wherever that sex exchange is, that many, many, many women, men and transgendered folks report, girls, boys, report being sexually assaulted, that someone doesn't pay them for what they do, or they take it and they hurt them. And that is absolutely part of the life of a sex trafficking victim, is that sexual abuse. Violence or threats of abuse, that can be from their trafficker. That can be telling them they better do what they've been told and they better hand over their money, or they have a quota that they have to earn that day, or something terrible will happen to them. Oftentimes girls report that they've seen that trafficker hurt someone else in front of them, so sometimes it's just the threat of violence. These can have nothing, violence and threats of violence can have nothing to do with the actual sex trafficking. It can simply be that the relationship between the trafficker and the victim is a love relationship, and in that there is domestic violence, that it exists already, and then it turns into a forced fraud and coercion to exchange sex outside the relationship. The physical trauma, we see women, men and transgender folks with extensive physical health issues. They have extensive exposure problems. I'll talk about this a little bit more in the presentation, but we're seeing clients go to the emergency room quite often for care. They have blunt force trauma injuries. They have physical trauma from having so much sexual activity that they have STIs and STDs, and they have a lot of physical trauma, connective tissue illnesses, things that our clients are reporting, asthma. Some of it is drug-related, some of it is drug use-related, but some of it is simply by living in this lifestyle that is so difficult and physically complicated. And the last thing under sexual exploitation is we see pervasive domestic violence. Many, many, many of the relationships that I see that result with sex trafficking is that there's a love relationship that begins and it ends with exploitation of the woman. So most of our clients are women. It doesn't mean that there aren't men or transgender people, and we will talk more about that. But what we see is women in these relationships, and it seemed like a good relationship in the beginning. It seemed like that there was some love and attachment. They may have a child with their boyfriend or their husband, and at some point it shifts. Either the pimp becomes clear on who and what he is and what his expectations of her are, or they just need money for drugs. And I've worked with a woman whose husband of many years, 10 years or more, pushed her outside the hotel room and said, don't come back without $300. I don't care what you have to do. So we see victimization come from parents of minors. I've worked with women who were in their early 20s whose parents were still trafficking them. We see a lot of relationship violence within the world of sex trafficking. So this is a rendering of what we think the coupling of domestic violence and sex trafficking is, this overlap that is really important. And I want to be really clear that this is not absolute. These categories are not perfect, but I do want you to know that we spent a lot of time and spoke to a lot of people, including clients who've been trafficked for lots of different types over time, and asked them if they thought that this made sense. So in both domestic violence and sex trafficking, we see violence, of course, physical violence, emotional violence, sexual violence, all different types of relationship violence. We see grooming. We see that the person who's in the relationship is courted in some way. We see them being trained to accept the behavior of the offender or the batterer. We see secrecy. Trafficking victims speak extensively about being secret keepers and about being told that if they tell anyone because what they're doing is criminal, that they'll be arrested, that they'll get in trouble for it. We know that's also present in domestic violence, that what happens in this house stays in this house, that there's secrecy is a part of the way that domestic violence continues in our community, that people don't tell, children know not to tell, wives know not to tell, victims know not to tell. We see psychological abuse and instability in both of those. We see traffickers often make sure that their victim does not know what's happening next. They don't know where they're sleeping the next night. They move them from place to place. They make sure that they know exactly how low of a human being they are. They're told repetitively that no one else would care about them, no one else would ever pay attention to them, that they're not worth anything. And so the battering that we see emotionally in both domestic violence and sex trafficking is very pervasive. Those are things that are very difficult for us to measure, that psychological abuse, that emotional abuse. But we do hear over and over that the words that he said to her really stuck with her, and even if he hit her or beat her or raped her, those words she would sort of start saying to herself, and it would happen inside. We see in both domestic violence and sex trafficking there's an intimate romantic relationship, so that it doesn't usually begin with someone grabbing a girl off the street and making her go sell her body for sex, that it has to do with courting and some sort of a relationship that builds, that gets her to want to do what he wants her to do. And then sometimes it switches once she's been doing it for a little while, that he's no longer satisfied with what she's making. And we have traffickers who bring other women into the relationship, and it becomes much more complex. But oftentimes we see women who've had children with their pimp or their trafficker, and they really deeply care about that person. They may believe that that is the only person that will ever love them and accept them for who they are, even if they're forcing them or coercing them to give up all of their money and make them do things that they don't want to do. We see in these relationships sometimes a woman will be pregnant and she'll have a baby, and the trafficker will give her 24 hours to pull her body together, and then he wants her back out on the street to make the quota. So we're talking about multiple levels of violence, multiple levels of force, fraud, and coercion that is very important. And that goes into the next topic, which is dominance and power, that we see in both domestic violence and sex trafficking, extensive diffusion of power from the victim, that they have no control of money, they have no control of what they're going to do, what they're going to wear, how they're going to do it. And of course, in every relationship, it's very different. But if I speak with my clients, which I see each week, and I say, who runs your house? They don't make any decisions. They don't decide what they're having for dinner or what kind of nail polish to wear. Part of coercing someone into doing something that they don't want is taking all of their control away, taking all of their power away, so they never have any money, they rarely have enough food to eat, they're often living in situations that are very unstable, so they're on really unstable footing, so they can't make decisions to leave. It's much more complicated to leave when you have very little ability to make a decision, and you've been disempowered to that point. We see in both domestic violence and sex trafficking relationships these rules that are very difficult. That goes back to the instability. The rules change, but there are rules. We see very clearly in sex trafficking relationships that most of the clients that I've worked with have said they weren't allowed to look at an African American man in the face. They weren't allowed to stay for more than 2 or 3 minutes after they completed their sex act to talk to the John that they were servicing, that they have rules. The money goes straight to the trafficker. We see those also in domestic violence relationships. We see that the rules are unique to each relationship, but they are very, very clearly delineated, and that people find that if they break a rule, sometimes they don't know what the rules are, and the rules keep changing, but they're very clear that there are rules that dominate that relationship. Things that we think are somewhat unique to sex trafficking, we see that exploitation, that money is coming into the hands of the woman or the transgendered person or the man or the girl or the boy, and it is taken straight by the trafficker, who gives her, if any money, very little money. And that blatant exploitation, he opens credit cards in her name, he buys cars in her name, he rents places in her name, and it's this kind of abject exploitation based on her exchanging sex for money, but it turns into all these other types of exploitation. Certainly in domestic violence, we have economic abuse that people have, but it seems like there maybe is a little bit of uniqueness in the sex trafficking exploitation of money. In sex trafficking, there's a unique subculture, and that includes a language that is spoken. There are things that people call their names that people call each other, and I'll go into a little bit of when we talk about the signs. But there's a language to it. There's a stroll or the gutter or a pimple demand that his partner calls him daddy, and we don't see those kinds of rules and subcultures called in sex trafficking. It's called the game or the life, and we don't see that in domestic violence. We don't see a community that has developed around that kind of victimization. I think domestic violence relationships are very isolated from each other, where sex trafficking victimization is a cultural issue. Pimps often and traffickers often know each other. Girls on the street know each other. They see each other's victimization, and they don't do anything to rescue. That's two down, the victimization of people outside the primary relationship that do not help or assist. So the clients that I work with are forced, frauded, or coerced into having sexual relationships with many people outside that relationship. And I have rarely, if ever, heard someone who is a customer provide services to them or help them escape or do something kind for them to help them get out of that situation. So when so many people are aware of the victimization and no one does anything to rescue, we feel that is a long-term impact psychologically of really not being able to trust other people and getting help that you need that is not offered by many, many people who've seen your victimization. Sexual activity outside the primary relationship is something we always see in sex trafficking relationships. There's always sex exchanges with someone who is not the trafficker and not the victim, and that we think is unique. And then if you go up to stigma, I very much acknowledge that domestic violence victims have an inherent stigma to them that is not something that I think has been easy for the community to talk about and certainly victims to talk about. But I do believe that sex trafficking victims have a stigma that is very costly to them in situations where they're help seeking. So if they're in a shelter, a homeless shelter, and they tell their roommate that they're a trafficking victim, and their roommate, can decide that their children aren't going to play with that person's children anymore because of what they've done, that they've been they see them as a prostituted person or a prostitute and not as a victim of domestic violence or sex trafficking. So learning, helping our community learn that sex trafficking is inherently a victimization, that these are people who are stigmatized and oftentimes ostracized from services is part of the reason that we're having this conversation. So some risk factors for sexual exploitation. There are about 8 researchers around the country, including the Office of Sex Trafficking Intervention Research that I direct, that are really focused on trying to understand how people become victims of sexual exploitation, and then what it is that they need to rehabilitate or find a new life and find some promise in their future. So some of the things that we see repetitively in the literature is child abuse, specifically sexual abuse. We don't know if that is technically a predictor or if it is a risk factor that just seems to show up often. What we do know regarding that childhood abuse is that if their parent has been involved in sex trafficking, so if their parent or an uncle was a trafficker, their mom was a prostituted woman, their aunt, someone, their grandmother, that we see cycles within these homes that have child abuse in them. So these children may be neglected, may be exposed to many people who would like to sexually abuse them. They're in unsafe, unstable housing, and those things, all of the things that you'll see down this list are more prevalent in those kinds of environments for kids because it's obviously less supervision, less ability to help seek, and there are reasons that these kids are at highest risk. We see kids whose parents have alcohol problems or drug use problems who have been doing drug and alcohol use in front of them. We see that there's a early access to drug use sometimes before they're 10 years old, simply based on exposure or parents thinking giving their children alcohol is an excuse for some of their behavior. But we see a lot of, again, that cyclical relationship with alcohol and drugs is that our clients become drug and alcohol dependent because of what they've seen and because of what they've been exposed to in their childhood. Oftentimes, we see clients report that they've been exposed to domestic violence, neglect, or abandonment in that childhood home. Again, multi-systemic exposure to violence or neglect in those homes. And one of the highest risk factors is this running away. Is kids who are running away from something often find something when they run to it. So these are people who are opportunists. We'll find them on the street or in homeless shelters or in the bus station. And these are kids who, without question, will always need food or a place to sleep. And when you have absolutely no other choices except for your body, that seems to be what we see kids making in these cases. So when we looked at the research and explored some of the pathways with the clients that we see each week here in Phoenix, we did not find a very specific pathway that went, if this happens to you, and this happens to you, and this happens to you, you're more likely to be sex trafficked. What we found was that boys, girls, men, transgendered adults, women were from all different economic groups, but they had some things that were in common. Oftentimes, drugs come into play either before the sex trafficking experience or during the sex trafficking experience. So we don't know. Excuse me. We don't know exactly where in the lineup of the trafficking experience. That's pretty consistent in the research. We do know that oftentimes sex trafficking victims have been. We think about 22% of the women in our community who identify as sex trafficking victims were trafficked when they were under the age of 18. So what that says is they didn't have, too much talking. What they didn't have is the opportunity to finish high school, develop work skills, and simply have very, very little economic opportunity. So we see that these are women who have very few choices. We've worked with women with many children, many fathers of their children who simply cannot make ends meet on any type of support, cannot get a job that can help them meet their needs, and they're really in trouble. And this, again, when you have very few choices or no choices, this is an opportunity because you still have your body. And it seems like once someone makes this choice, it's very difficult to change it, to get out of the trafficking situation. We're starting to see an increase in gang involvement in sex trafficking in our community. We know that prostitution and gangs have always been related, but for some reason we're seeing more involvement with minors and their gang affiliation. What happens when we work with clients who are gang affiliated is they have some different problems that they present with. If they have a familial history of violence or criminal behavior, that these are clients who, if they want to make changes in their life, have to move out of their community, have to make very significant changes, and that's difficult to ask of anyone. But it's something that we see as an enormous barrier and identified by them as an opportunity to leave. If everyone that you know is involved, it's very difficult to change from that life. We do know that if everyone in your community is being trafficked or is a trafficker, and that's what I've worked with girls who've said, when I was 12, my mom said it was time. Or I've worked with women who said, when I was 13, I decided I was going to have my own money. I was watching all the people that I knew in my neighborhood earn money, and I was going to do it too, and it didn't look that bad. So she immediately, of course, was trafficked by her mother, who said, all right, I'm not going to stop you, but you have to pay our rent now, and you have to give me the money, but you're allowed to buy the iPad or whatever it was that you wanted to buy. And that's how the trafficking began. So it's very complex, as in every domestic violent relationship. We see these relationships in trafficking be very complex and very difficult to change once they've been insinuated. So we also do not know a whole lot about the way that males who are youth or adults and transgendered adults and youth get involved in trafficking situations. We do see some organic differences. Oftentimes we see less drug involvement, but that's not 100%. We just are just beginning some of our research here in Phoenix on developing new knowledge and making recommendations for new services for males. And we work closely with a number of people in the transgender community who've been formerly trafficked, just to be better informed, but we certainly have a lot to learn in those two areas. So here are some things that we know on how people get pulled into the life. So the first one we talked about already, which was running away and living on the streets, that absolute basic need of people who have very few other options, have their body and have the ability to sell it or trade it or do what they need to get their needs met. And oftentimes we see these kids served in our community by some amazing organizations who are drug using, oftentimes present with some mental illness, and came from homes that had lots and lots of traumatic exposure. The second type of trafficker is called a Romeo pimp, and that is, we call that the book out of Canada that talks about love bombing, that these are girls who are love bombed by this trafficker. They're told that they're beautiful, everything that's ever been missing in their life is filled in by this trafficker. And soon into the relationship, he convinces her that perhaps this is a good idea. Often, I've worked with women who said they've been in a relationship with their trafficker for 6 months before he mentioned that he wanted her to go and have sex with people outside of their relationship. Oftentimes, it's associated with his career going into music or going into something for him, that if she could just earn enough money for them to stay in a hotel in a big city, that he could follow his dreams, and didn't she love him enough for him to follow his dreams. The gorilla pimp, we see the gorilla pimp being either a male or a female, primarily male, but we see women in this role also. And this is the most violent type of trafficker. This is the person who, once he gets a girl in his possession, whatever that looks like, he is very violent, very threatening, really terrifying, and will kill his victims if they don't follow his rules. So they have constant violence over their heads. I've worked with women who said that the guy told them if they didn't do what he said, they would go and find their 2-year-old son and kill the kid. That they have babies with these women sometimes, and they give the baby to their moms and only let them see the babies if they do what he says, for example, on weekends. But what that does is it says that the gorilla pimp's family or someone else is involved in these. The next one is international domestic major crime operations. Very rarely do we see single pimps working alone. Sometimes we do, and it is important to note that there is certainly some organization in that culture, and it's something that we have to learn about that's very different from domestic violence. These are people who communicate with each other. They might have one trafficker might go to another trafficker's victim and try to convince her to leave and come to him, and he's really just making her original trafficker is just making sure she's really loyal, which is one of the linguistics of trafficking, is this loyalty and faith, and that you'll never leave me. Gang-related prostitution, we spoke about a little bit, is certainly an important role. Is that the role of women in gangs? Do they recruit outside of gangs to have prostituted women? Both of those seem to happen in our community. I've worked with quite a few women who reported that their parent or relative was their trafficker. Sometimes it's their brother, but it's part of their community, and it's obviously very troubling. But we see sort of the range of traffickers. Number 7 is probably what people think when they look at, there's 2 things that we see on CNN or some of the bigger ways that we look at sex trafficking. One is the girl is ripped off the bus stop and she was an innocent victim and was trafficked. And the other one is this girl entered it because she thought it would be fun. Very rarely do we see people without some of those risk factors. So they come from a home where things aren't going well and people are dangerous and they're exposed to a lot of violence or abuse or neglect, and then we see that they say, well, that looked better than what I was living. So we do see very rarely that, but not often. And number 8, the final one, is the gay male culture. Is it a way to enter the hustle market? Is it a cultural issue with Hispanic or Latino boys? Is it something for Native American youth? We're really just learning what is happening in our for sex trafficked males, especially for minors. We really just don't know a lot, so we're learning.
We do have one question about, Yvonne had asked on chat if the PowerPoint will be made available after the webinar, and the answer is yes. Dr. Rose Sepowitz is kindly going to share that with us to put on our website, so thank you for that.
So here are the pretty typical things that we see with our clients, those exposure-related health issues. We keep your eye on the clock for me. Exposure, what time are we done? About 3? Okay. And you want me to stop about 10 for questions? About 10 more minutes? Okay. So we do see some exposure-related health issues. I actually had a client about 4 years ago who had the same pair of sneakers on, which were not the proper size sneakers. She was a street-level prostituted woman and had a really tough life. Some significant mental illness, but her shoes had been on her feet straight for about 6 months, and they had to surgically remove them from her feet. They had grown into her foot, so she wasn't able to take them off after a while and simply hadn't taken them off previous to that. So they were significantly smaller than her foot, and then, of course, became infected and had some really significant health-related issues due to that growing into her foot. So things that we just can't imagine, I think, in most situations we see. We see a lot of teeth issues and infections and long-term pain related to, dental, lack of dental support, long-term. I've worked with women who said that they haven't seen a doctor since the birth of their last child, which was 14 years ago. So just long exposure without good health services in any way, even if they had a health service issue, that they didn't have the resources or their trafficker would not allow them to receive services. So we see sexual activity-related health issues, especially with our minors. We see that their bodies simply cannot handle the activity. We see STIs being very prevalent. We know from our health department here that syphilis has become an issue again in our community and across the country. And some of that is related to people not being able to protect themselves in these situations, their trafficker having control of condoms or not allowing them to use them, or the trafficker being willing to take more money for a non-condom sexual activity, and the victim not having any say in it due to lack of access to things like condoms or any resources to protect herself or himself. Drug-related health issues, oftentimes we see clients at Project Rose, which is an intervention that we do in partnership with 14 other organizations. The drug-related health issues we often see are abscesses that have, again, not gotten attention for long periods of time. Sometimes we see clients who have, especially in our transgender community, who inject. We had a client once who was injecting Mazola oil into her hips, and the resulting abscesses were the size of dessert plates, and just very extensive infection related to that, and something that could go septic and really have long-term systemic issues. So those drug-related health issues can affect blood pressure and skin illnesses and keep going. We've seen quite a number of clients in the last couple of years with MRSA, which is certainly related to exposure and not having appropriate health coverage and attention, and we have to be careful with that. Violence-related health issues, I've worked with clients who were in car accidents with a customer who was drunk and who broke many bones in their bodies. I've worked with women who've had acid poured on their face because their trafficker no longer wanted them and is blind in one eye. We've worked with women who have had who've been hung from the ceiling. We've worked with people who've had been hit with a baseball bat. I think these are things that you see also in domestic violence. We see extensive human-on-human physical violence, but it's really important to note that the love relationship oftentimes is not both-sided. So these are attackers who are hurting someone that who is a commodity to them. So oftentimes we don't see these happening with the younger women unless it's to keep them in line. We see these with the older women who are having more and more trouble maintaining the lifestyle and really having a difficult time. So this is very much based on exposure, except that we see, again, our minors having pretty significant issues as well. Mental health issues are important to think about. These are one of the questions that we don't know is, do they have mental health challenges prior to being trafficked, or are these things due to the trafficking experience? And I think what we realize is that it's probably a little bit of both. We acknowledge that trafficking victimization is quite complex, and the things that they are exposed to during that trafficking experience are enough to believe that in some cases they're going to be killed, in some cases they are really harmed, and those are enough to be legitimate for post-traumatic stress disorder. One of the things we don't know is, were they suicidal before, after? Sometimes when someone is trafficked when they're 12 or 14 or 17, they don't have a great history of what their life was like and how they felt about themselves when they were much younger. We do see our clients talk about feeling really angry and having experiences of violence, going into red rages or black rages, and just not having a whole lot of access to other emotions once they've been trafficked for a period of time, and just really disconnecting to their emotions. And that's part of the rehabilitation process. That's part of what we need to do. And finally, dissociative disorders. One of the things that we hear over and over is that they just checked out, that they checked out during the experience. I think we hear domestic violence victims report that as well. But one of the things that we know is dissociative disorders are really wonderful when you're in the middle of a traumatic situation, that thank goodness that it lets us check out and we don't feel present and maybe we don't remember it quite as well. But what happens with our clients is they dissociate pretty much all the time. So they'll be in an interview or they'll be talking to someone in jail. Someone will be telling them what to do and they'll have checked out. And it becomes really dangerous for them. They're not as connected to their mind and their body as they need to be to keep themselves safe. So we have problems when we start dealing with people with their symptoms. Let me go to the next one.
Okay, we've got a couple questions. One was, did you say canola oil? Like what was
Mazola.
What is that, and why would they do that? I have the same question.
So it is, they injected it to try to get curvature to their hips. So it was a man transforming into a female, and they were trying to create a curve by injecting a kind of a wad of Mazola oil. And the result, of course, was that our body doesn't absorb Mazola oil through our derma and through our subcutaneous areas, that we have to be really careful that it goes where we can digest it.
Yeah.
So this was a sort of a self-help type of transformation for a transgendered person that was really dangerous and led to some major medical issues.
I bet.
Another question.
Yeah, it says, what is the difference between a red and black rage? I'm curious about that.
My clients talk about it really differently. Some people say, I see red, and then I kind of lose control. And other clients have talked about a black rage, which means they black out and they have no memory of what happened. So that's why I said the two. That is not a clinical diagnosis. But those are the two words that my clients tend to use when they talk about it.
So black is more of they may be doing things, they just don't have memory of it.
Right. So they're completely checked out. They're just kind of primal. And the red rage is they see red. They are more violent than they kind of expected themselves to. But they seem to be present while they're raging. But that, again, is not a clinical terminology.
Sure. Okay. It says, what are the statistics between mental health issues versus non-mental health issues?
So do you mean that, I guess I'm going to say your question is, are there people who kind of come out of this life unscathed without mental health? Is that what you think that means?
I'm not sure. Let's see. Melissa, do you want to clarify your question for us? Oh, wait a minute here.
We can go to the next slide if you're okay. I think maybe I clarified it. That's a good question.
That's a good question.
One person would like to enter. Oh, wow. So cool.
We're learning how this webinar software works as we go, so it's exciting over here.
So I'll keep talking until we get, there she is. What are the numbers? A little bit later, I don't know if it's in this presentation, that we have some data on, no, I don't have, we do have some statistics. What's difficult is our clients rarely, I work with clients through the diversion program here in Phoenix, the prostitution diversion. We also work with kids at Tumbleweed who are 18 to 24, and we work at Florence Crittenden. We have a group on trafficking. But what we don't have is the ability to do mental health assessments of those in all of those settings. So we don't have the ability to diagnose them with PTSD or do more clinical interviews with them because of the situations and settings that they're in. But what we do know is when we talk about post-traumatic stress disorder in our psychoeducation group, that they do often, I would say more than 90% identify that post-traumatic stress disorder is present in their life, and that they self-identify that this is, when we kind of write it up on the board and all the pictures of it, that there is a lot of that. I think when we ask, so here's a question that we've looked at our data and we've done some analysis of people's life histories. When you ask someone if they have a medical problem, people are quicker and seem to have gotten better medical services. So they may say, well, I have asthma because I was diagnosed when I was a kid, or I have my ankle hurts and I know I have arthritis in it. But what we don't see is that these clients historically have gotten great mental health services. So we think that the reports of people who have bipolar disorder or schizophrenia are very low compared to the medical reports. So people report many, many medical problems and very, very few mental health problems, simply because I think they haven't had the opportunity to be drug-free, number one, which is required to do a good mental health assessment, but also haven't been in settings perhaps where they had that diagnosis given to them that would be helpful. So if someone has post-traumatic stress disorder, maybe they self-identified, but lots and lots of clients have said to us, I know something's wrong with me. I have something, I'm either happy or sad. Some of that is withdrawals from drugs, but some of that is maybe that's how they were before they used drugs and they have a mood disorder. It's very difficult for us to, it's very, we don't have a system right now that assesses their mental health status for us to collect. Okay, so the next slide is about relationships in these trafficking situations. So we talked about the trafficker, that there are these other types of relationships with the trafficker. There's relationships with men who don't protect them. There are relationships with people who work in hotels that don't protect them. They have a distorted intimacy. What is intimacy? What is trust? All of those pieces that we ask our clients once they're out of the life to sort of be okay with. How do we ask them to have normal, trusting relationships with other women, normal, trusting relationships with their children, normal, trusting relationship with Child Protective Services? All of those other types of things are very complicated. So one of the things that we see, and I think you also find in domestic violence clients, is the rules that they've lived with in that intimacy are very convoluted, and they don't know how to begin again and what that looks like again.
We have another question. What are the numbers in regards to our homeless children being lured into sex trafficking?
Melissa, that's a good question. So we provide a psychoeducation group called STAR, Sex Trafficking Awareness and Recovery at Tumbleweed, their drop-in center on 16th Street and McDowell. And what we find is the clients there who are 18 to 24 report there is extensive trafficking of homeless youth. Are they being trafficked by a pimp? That is yet to be kind of understood. The boys oftentimes say they haven't been trafficked. The girls often say they have been trafficked. Boys will traffic. They say, I'll traffic myself. I'll traffic a girl if I have her with me. It's a little bit difficult to get our hands on what is the trafficking situation. We do see that they are very often sex exchanging. We call that survival sex, that they are doing some sort of sex exchange for a safe place to sleep. I don't know how safe it is, but a place to sleep, for drugs, for food, for alcohol, whatever it is that they are needing. We see that pervasively. We see a lot of sex exchanging being reported at some of our very large homeless centers where youth who are 18 and over can sleep or stay, and that they feel like that it's everywhere, that just right around the corner in every alley that they're constantly being pursued to exchange sex for something. So certainly that is a very high risk for our homeless youth, and that's something that in other states they've done a really good job. In Dallas, for example, in Dallas, Texas, they track their homeless youth, the kids who are running away, and if they've been reported by CPS 4 times or more in a year, they kind of put an APB out for them, or whatever that means. They go looking for them, because those are the kids that are at highest risk. Kids who are homeless and run away, not necessarily homeless with their family in homeless programs, but certainly homeless and run away are the ones that have the poorest supervision, the least amount of ability to advocate and protect themselves. So here are some warning signs that are helpful for a system to understand these. We asked for this information from our trafficked victims who were trafficked when they were kids. So we asked them if we were going to work with law enforcement, courts, victim advocates. We're trying to put together a police pocket card. What would it look like? And these were the things that they were very clear about, especially with minors. That an older boyfriend, an older male presence is very important. Sometimes they're traveling with an older male and multiple women. The reality is, if there's a situation that sounds funny or looks funny, that is something to investigate, especially if there's an older male involved. We see chronic runaways, that history of abuse, multiple STIs. We had one of my staff that runs a group with minors said that she worked with a girl who was getting tested for multiple STIs, and one of the staff at her group home said to her, well, that'll teach you. And really what it was this girl had been trafficked for a long period of time by a trafficker, and those STIs were not simply from being promiscuous, that these were things that were coming because of being, lack of access to condoms and ways of protecting herself. So we know that group home person probably didn't mean harm, but not being aware that multiple STIs is an indicator, or multiple pregnancies is an indicator of unusual exposure to sexual activity that simply isn't appropriate for that age, whatever that is. You know what I mean? Okay. Signs of violence. Of course, school nurses need to pay attention. Emergency rooms need to pay attention. Group homes, residential programs, detention programs need to be looking for certain things like that. We do know that there are multiple system involvement, so they may be poly offenders. They may be also boosting and stealing things from stores. They may be using drugs. They may be doing other things that look like criminal behavior and delinquency, but are actually doing it at the commands of their trafficker, because the trafficker is telling them. So the thing that's most important to remember about a trafficker is they're constantly putting their victim out into harm's way, to get caught by the police, to be hurt or killed, to be doing the things that earn the money, and simply not being willing to do any of those himself. So rarely do we see traffickers who are doing anything that's breaking the law, that they leave that to their victim, who they force, fraud, and coerce. So the next one is tattoos or other brands, and I think in the next slide, I do have some data in here. The next slide, yeah, go ahead, are some examples of some local tattoos, and it oftentimes has money. It oftentimes has things like loyalty and faith in it, specific to a person's name or a man's name. Sometimes it's a dollar sign. It really depends. But trafficking tattoos have a some uniqueness to them, and we actually identify them as brands instead of tattoo. A tattoo is something we think is something that adorns us. A brand is telling us that we're property of someone else. So, yeah.
What does this one say on the right top?
One and only, lay low.
Oh.
So can you go back one?
Mm-hmm.
So if we go back one, here's some terminology that we hear our clients talk about, that this is the game, that being in trafficking and sex exchanging is a game, or they're part of the game. We hear very often our clients talk about having their pimp tell them to call them daddy. We've worked with girls and women who call their boyfriends or pimps, traffickers, sugar daddy, a boss, a manager. Oftentimes we see girls who are in strip clubs. Their manager was their manager and then became their trafficker. Some of the language that you'll see in sex ads and people will talk about are call out and call in. Call out means that person will go to someone else's house or hotel, or meet them somewhere else, and a call in is that they have a hotel room or a place where they will do the sex exchange. I've had clients tell me that they were a dancer and an escort in the city of Phoenix. We have 2 people who are licensed escorts. You can be a licensed dancer here and theoretically you have to be 18 and over to be a dancer in a strip club, but we do see a significant amount of our girls who come through the prostitution diversion or who picked up for prostitution who reported that they were strip dancing. Something called a bottom or a bottom girl. There's also, I'm not going to say it, there's another word for that too. But a bottom is a person who is the top girl. That's sort of how the linguistics of trafficking works. She's the one that grooms the girls that come in after her. She's usually been trafficked the longest and is the most tied to that trafficker, the most connected. He can trust her the most. She's endured the most, and that is the bottom girl. And oftentimes when we see cases go to court with a minor, for example, the bottom girl might just be a little bit older than the minor, and maybe she's 18 or 19, but she's found complicit. She's found to be a participant because she groomed the girl. She found her on the street. She taught her what to do. She may even have been part of the enforcement to get her to do what she wanted. A trick or date is how we hear people talk about a customer. They do not call them Johns or customers. They call them tricks or date. And that's important in the linguistics when people talk about going on a date. It has simply a different connotation than we have. How are you doing? Okay. One more?
Yeah, it is 3, but we had a late start. So,
okay. So I just want to make sure. So we can even end on this slide. I want to talk about, we have a number of other ones that you'll receive when you get the PowerPoint, but I want to tell you about when we try to work with clients who are exiting. We have a number of programs in our area. We have the Catholic Charities Dignity House, which is a 6-month or a 1-year program, and they work with women on reclaiming their lives. You can't have children to live there, though. Similar to Mama's House, which is in South Phoenix, and they also a woman cannot have children, but they can go and get very specific sex trafficking interventions. And these are the things that we see that are really the most complicated: the drug addiction, the having complicated relationships that are very difficult to transform. And we see that kind of working through the lifespan, that even once a person's gotten rescued and out of the life, that changing those relationship problems are very complicated. If they've been in the game for a while, it's hard to come back to normal life, regular life. They call us squares, and I don't know how a square lives. I don't know how to get up in the morning and go to work. I don't know how to, when I have a conflict at work, how to not punch someone in the face. How do I work through things? Because that's just not how the rules of the game went. If you were angry, you acted out. You didn't have any rules about that kind of behavior. And really struggling with trying to find something else to earn money to do. These are people who oftentimes do not have strong education and strong economic opportunities, and we find that our clients are really struggling with minimum wage and maybe some social services to move ahead. We do notice that if a client has more motivation to change, that they're more likely to get out. So it's something we're trying to assess now. We're trying to say, are you done with this life? Are you ready to move on? And sometimes I hear women say, you know what, I've learned a lot about myself. I've enjoyed your group. I've enjoyed all the groups here at the diversion program. I'm just not ready yet. I'm not ready to do something different. So prior traumatic experiences, oftentimes, if a person comes from a childhood full of trauma, they don't maybe know what would be like to be in a situation where there isn't chaos and trauma around them. They're afraid of what's next. They don't know if they believe in themselves or if they're worth it. They maybe don't even know who they are and what they like. We had a woman recently tell us a story about how when every time she went out to dinner, her pimp would pick what she was having for dinner. So it was always the same thing, and she hated that thing, and she had to eat it for years because that's what he picked for her. It was always the same food. So she really just not even knowing what she liked and who she was. And not having a future focus. When you're told that you're worthless and you're going to do exactly what I say for a period of time, it's very hard to look forward and have hope. So thank you so much for your time. I'm really interested in having any questions.
You have one. Says, what happens to the women who have children and where can they go for help?
So that's one of the gaps in our community and really one of the reasons that I'm here to appeal to you in the domestic violence community to become partners and sort of absorb some of the sex trafficking clients that we serve. There really aren't any places that are trafficking specific. So if a client were to go to a domestic violence shelter, she would get all of the wonderful programming, or a homeless family shelter. She would get all of that fantastic programming and transformative services, but there wouldn't be any addressing of the sex trafficking issues that we just talked about. There wouldn't be sex trafficking specific intervention, trauma-focused intervention, whatever it is that that person needs. They would get all of the other things about the relationship violence and the domestic violence and the economic abuse, but we would miss that small corner, which the research has shown is really important in that transformation out.
We have another question coming in while we're waiting for that. I think knowing that we have a lot of, like you were saying, homeless and domestic violence shelter and program providers that are probably on the line, other than looking for signs, what would be, like step one for how they would help someone if they do recognize signs and think, I think this might be a sex trafficking situation?
So I think primarily we would hope that service providers become comfortable in talking about it and saying as part of their intake that that's a question, which doesn't take away the problem of trafficking. What it does is takes away the stigma of them answering that question. So if it's in a printed form and someone says, well, these are the things that we expect people to come in with, then it sort of takes away the awful feeling of I'm going to tell you something and you're going to tell me I can't stay here. So if sex trafficking is part of the conversation in facilities that it's not, we're not saying that it's something to be desired, but if someone reports it, that they're not ostracized or they're not stigmatized for it. So we would like questions asked. So there are things that you can ask for youth. When you were running away, where did you stay? Who did you stay with? Has anyone ever asked you to do something sexually that you didn't want to do? After that question, you would say, have they ever asked you to do something that you didn't want to do for money or for drugs or a place to stay? So some of it is us being really comfortable with asking questions. And then I think most of all I hear is that people are nervous to ask because then they don't know what to do next. They don't know where to send them and how to help them. And I think that's a really large issue where we're working on trying to figure out how big the problem is in our community and trying to access all of the services that we can for them. So there are a couple of very specific programs. For example, for minors, we have Streetlight USA out in the West Valley. We have Natalie's House in Tonopah. We have some programs, but they just fill this teeny piece. So when you get access to the PowerPoint, there's a slide that talks about how many beds there are in Arizona. Can you just go to that one? It really talks about some of the major gaps.
Did I go
one more? Go one more back. So this is how many kids and adults were served who are identified as domestic violence victims in 2012. So almost 10,000 kids and adults served in these amazing programs in our community that we should be very proud of. If you go to the next one.
Absolutely.
There are 52 beds for youth and 18 beds for adults in all of Arizona for sex trafficking specific. So there's simply no way that this is tenable for us. There's no way that all of the services can be provided to the victims that we see in these beds. There's just not, it's simply not possible. The 18 beds for adults are both long-term programs, so they're often full. They rarely have room, and none of those adult beds have places for women with children. We simply have a complete absence of it. There are a couple of short-term programs like the Dream Center that has access for women with children, but they simply aren't set up specifically for trafficking. And we work with NCADD, which is an amazing program, and they have programs for women with children who are substance abusing, and they are becoming much more involved in the sex trafficking community. But again, they're full often. They have lots of other services. All right.
So what was the acronym?
NCADD, the National Council of Drug and Alcohol. It's fantastic. It's unbelievable.
Okay, I was just curious.
Unbelievable organization.
Okay. Let's see. We have another question from Yvonne. She asked, does trafficking increase with sporting events such as the upcoming Super Bowl?
Interesting, Yvonne. Great question. We just got some research money to do some research on that, and I'll let you know a little bit after the Super Bowl here in 2015. We do think that when people come to the Valley with money and they're men, that we will see increased trafficking. What we don't know is does that bring traffickers from other communities bringing their victims here. So we know that money, but remember we have sporting events here almost every weekend. This past weekend we had a basketball game. We have the the Phoenix Open. We have NFL games here all the time. We have baseball games. We have spring training. We have lots of opportunities for men to come into our community and buy sex. So we certainly think we have a norm, a baseline that is pretty high based on that. So we're not sure if the Super Bowl is going to make a huge impact on that, but we certainly will see. We're going to do some research on the New York one coming up. So excellent question. I think what's been said in the past is that trafficking is rampant during those events, and we just don't know that to be true. Do I expect that we'll see an increase? Perhaps, but I'm very nervous about saying we think that that's different from when we've had a finals for basketball or other things that bring men to town with money.
Right. And I think there's also I'm not sure it's been proven either way that the Super Bowl causes more domestic violence either. I've heard.
Really?
Yeah, I've heard conflicting reports on that too. So maybe you'll get some insight into that when you look into your portion. Okay, another question. It says, in our domestic violence program at Against Abuse, we would discover those issues during an intake process and refer them to an outside agency for services more specific to that issue.
Okay.
I'm curious if you want to share. I think your name is Quintana. I probably said that wrong. It's very pretty. If you could tell us maybe where you tend to refer people, it might be helpful for others to know where that is that you're doing that. Are there other questions? You can call me. All right.
Cute. Very nice.
Yes, very nice. Quintana's being nice and saying we can call her Q. She's very kind.
So one of the solutions is to send them out, but one of the realities is if you look in your shelter now and you think about how many people you think in there have been trafficked, some of the practicality is finding other agencies to serve them. There are so few of them. So is there something internally that we can have shelters and homeless supporters, domestic violence shelters, victim advocates, prosecutors, kind of have a better eye for who these victims are, and then they themselves be the providers. They themselves have groups or provide services to those trafficking victims in-house instead of depending on the very, very limited resources that we have in our community. So we believe there are thousands of people who've been trafficked in our community, whether they're kids or adults, who are now in the system somehow, whether they're in prisons or jails or domestic violence shelters, homeless resource programs. And if we don't ask them, we won't know. But if we ask them, and then we think that everyone's going to get services through Catholic Charities, who has a very small capacity, we're going to end up sort of running out of room. So my hope is that through conversations like this, that we can get services in-house and more programs and staff awareness and things like that can help trafficking victims be less stigmatized and have more opportunity to get the services they need. Oh, good.
Yeah,
right.
So Q is saying that Against Abuse uses helping associates and other private agencies, and at this time they don't have anyone in-house that would be equipped to deal with the situation. And I don't think you're alone on that.
Right.
I mean, I think we've heard that it's happening, but due a lot to the work that you're doing, Dr. Rosepowitz. We're learning a lot more about what that means and what it looks like. And I think this is a great conversation starter, in that we're talking about what it is that we can be looking for, because I'm sure just like we are saying that the crossover between homeless and DV is so blurred, I'm sure that sex trafficking is in the mix as well. And it like you're saying, it doesn't make sense to keep building exclusive resources for one situation when there's a lot of co-occurring issues. So
I think we would have a tougher time making the rationale for having all exclusive services.
Right.
Because I think we see partnerships being much, much more important than diffusing money into many, many services as opposed to investing within. And I want to extend to each of you that if you think that you would like to have someone come, at ASU we have a program called Train the Trainer. It's an ambassador program that we train folks on how to go back to their businesses or back to their agencies and talk about trafficking. We give you a movie, a DVD with a PowerPoint on it. We give you a 5-hour training. So the first one is, I think, February and then the next one is in April. So if you're interested, my email address will be at the end of the PowerPoint. But I'm more than happy. It's free. I'll even give you a nice Paradise Bakery lunch. It's grant funded. I'm not paying for it out of my pocket. But I would love for you to join us, and we are really looking for ambassadors who are interested in becoming sort of experts on trafficking who can then go out in the community and train. We feel like it's a really important thing to do, but we don't know how to do it, and I want to respect everyone's specialization and your expertise and your ability to train the people that you think are important. So we've gotten a grant to train 100 ASU students that they can go back and train their fraternities and train their sports teams, and we are going to subvert that and include as many community members as we can in those 2 trainings that are coming up in the spring.
Okay.
So thank you so much for your time.
I think it would be really helpful if you have information about the Train the Trainer training. If you want to send that to me, and I can send it out to everyone who has participated or signed up to participate in this, so that even if they weren't able to get in today, they would have some follow-up resources. I think that would be great. Are there any other burning questions before we sign off? I know we've gone a little long, but wanted to make sure that we get the questions answered as best we can. It looks like we don't. Maybe Q might have one. Oh, here we go. Okay. All right. Well, it looks like everyone's kind of signing off now. So if you have other questions, let me get to your. Oh, there's Dr. Rosepowitz's contact information. I know many of you know me, Renee Tenney, with the Maricopa Association of Governments. You can always contact me or Nikki Oxford, who you had originally said you would attend the webinar with, and any of us would be more than happy to make connections for you to get your questions answered or to move this information forward. So thank you so much, Dr. Rosepowitz, and thank you everyone for coming.